It's my privilege today to be joined by Gale Crosley. And I know many of you know Gale. She is on many lists of the top consultants in the public accounting world, and I would greatly concur with that opinion. I've had the privilege to work with Gale in a couple of capacities. In my public accounting days, as well as the infancy of my consulting practice, Gale has been someone that I've learned from, enjoyed now as a colleague to learn even more. And most importantly, as it relates to our conversation today, Gale has taught me a lot around the discipline of growth. So, Gale, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Gary. It's delightful to be here with you again, and I'm looking forward to the interchange.
Gale, when I think of the work that we've done together over the years, I can hear you saying to me often, and of course, reading your book and looking at what you blog about, you always connect the themes of discipline and growth together. When you think of that, particularly of the word discipline, why is that such an important topic for you as you coach and lead on the area of growth?
You know, it is at the very foundation of my practice. In fact, my tagline is the business discipline of practice growth. And the reason why is when I came back over here into CPA land after being in corporate America for many years, I found a shocking lack of discipline around growth. It was kind of like an extracurricular activity that, you know, we're all about the delivery side. If you take a look at the CPA firm and divide it in two, you have growth and you have service delivery. Well, the delivery side is really, really a strong muscle. We have principles and methodologies and resource deployments and tracking mechanisms. And when it comes to growth, this is core curriculum. It's after it's whenever we have time to do it, then we kind of squeeze it in type thing. So this muscle is really atrophied. And I said, that is the issue in our profession is if you can imagine a company where we made all the widgets, but we never we didn't care about the demand or driving demand or anything like that. We just build it and they will come. Well, that may have been true at some point in our profession, but it's not true anymore.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but as I work with our fellow professionals, I find that many of them have these great instinctive skills, whether it be in leadership or growth, but the ability to transition those instinctive skills into a discipline or a process or a habit is very difficult. And when I began working with you many, many years ago, I would have said that's where I was. I had these instincts for being out and about. And as I've said to you before, I never had a rubber chicken dinner that I didn't want to go to. You know, there's networks and opportunities to meet people, but making that into something is difficult. Why do you think that is, especially as you mentioned for CPAs that are generally speaking so process oriented?
Yeah. Well, when you think about your own experience, Gary, what was it about it that you brought to the table and the transformation that we were able to make? What was the difference and why, how did it happen and why did it happen?
Gale, in the life that I lived as an audit person, we had flow charts for everything. You know, you get an engagement letter, you move to the next step, you move to the next step, you move to the next step. And so there was this discipline, if you will, around the process of it. There was also this third party, whether it be a peer reviewer, the SEC, PCAOB, whatever it may be, who we knew we ultimately were going to be accountable to. And so you built infrastructure to make sure that you serve the client well, you met the regulations and all the things that are required. And I think in growth area, even though we all knew it was a distinguisher, if you could grow individually, your firm noticed it. If you could grow as a firm, your peers noticed it and others noticed it, but yet we never develop a methodology around that. We just always assume that's just what you do. You join Rotary, you join Kiwanis, you join the ACG, and you show up and magically it's going to grow. So I think for us and for me, it was definitely kind of that lack of a mirror type process in the growth area as opposed to what we did in practice.
And as you were moving through my process, did you see that it was just like the process of doing an audit, that it had methodologies and principles and all that?
It did, Gale. I think interestingly, as well as we had moved into niche development, you know, when we really wanted to know our industry, kind of knew where to go and what to do about it. But what you did and what I see as success for others is to bring a similar type framework to growth. And what areas do you want to grow? What do you know about that? As you would say to us, what's the pain point that may be out there, the pain either the potential client is having or something that's going on from an external force standpoint? What are those things that we can identify? So I think what it did is it kind of wired the connections in our brain to think about growth in the similar way that we thought about it from a practice standpoint.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, you're right on. I'm a former auditor, and so I think like an auditor, and I'm a very left brain kind of person at my very core. And I knew that all these principles that I had learned in corporate America basically resulted in a suite of generally accepted growth principles. Now, the issue in our profession is they're not codified anywhere, like GAP or GAS. You can go and you can read about them and so forth. But when it comes to growth, they're out there. But what I had to do is I had to go curate them from all of my years of experience and all of the inputs that I had, and curate them and package them in a way that was consumable for CPAs, so that if you're an observer and you're an uninformed observer of growth, you'll look at it superficially and say, oh, banker breakfast, lawyer lunch, golly, he did a great job there. We're spending a lot of money on Gary going out and hobnobbing among the elite. But what is not seen is the principles underneath. We're just seeing the surface and the general accepted growth principles underneath, like looking at the market first, looking at the market from the outside in, is a huge principle that requires rewiring of the brain, right? And
it takes a huge rewiring of the brain. And candidly, Gale, at first it seems a little overwhelming because you look at what you need to do, but then much like we would find in practice, is A follows A, then B, then C, then D, and as you move along, you realize it's not overly complicated if you follow a process, if you have a discipline around it, if you hold yourselves accountable to it, which probably transitions us into a conversation that you and I both enjoy having, and that's discipline. Somewhere in there, the word accountability generally comes up. So for those who are watching this video, if you've had the opportunity to work with Gale, you know that accountability is something that not only she expects, but she's very, very good at. You would be very nervous if you went on a call with Gale and didn't have your homework done, as an example. But in seriousness, Gale, you and what I try to do in working with managing partners on the leadership side, we know that accountability is very, very important. So when you think of discipline and accountability, how do you see that play out in what you do and why that's so important for the growth area as well?
So accountability is something that, as it relates to growth, it's important, or it was important back in the day, to be personally accountable, because it was an individual contribution sport like golf, right? You're a book of business partner, you're accountable to yourself, you're responsible for going out and driving your book of business and growing it and so forth. And so that personal accountability ended up in whatever, you were able to do to grow and keep satisfied clients. But now as you go along in your career, it's accountable way above the individual, because as a firm grows and as people become leaders are accountable not just personally, but they're accountable to their peers, to whoever they are beholden to up above them, like the managing partner, and they're accountable to the people who are reporting into them that they're responsible for. And so what happens is accountability becomes much more significant as a factor. And also, when you look at growth, you're looking at how are we growing today? We can't grow like a bunch of golfers. We have to grow at a more sophisticated level, which is leader-driven and team-based, because the market is too complex and it's mature. And therefore, the maturity requires us to drive specialization, and specialization requires leadership, because now it's not your book of business, you're specialized as the real estate leader in the firm, or the business valuation leader in the firm, and now you're not just doing growth individually and accountable only to yourself, but you're leading growth as a team, and now you have to be accountable to the team. And if you let the team down, you're letting down not only other people, but a significant chunk of the revenue potential of the firm itself. And so that's why it becomes so critical in the conditions that we're in and the sophistication that they require.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gail. Don't you think in some ways we look at accountability almost from the negative aspect of it, which is the hard work and feeling pressure. But on the other hand, and I can't remember where I read the quote, but I read a quote recently that basically said how empowering accountability is. That you've agreed to a set of goals, and so it gives you the freedom within the context of what you've agreed to go out and take chances. And so we think of accountability and we almost get protective. But in many ways, the opposite is true. So as you work with, whether it's someone that's going to lead a service line or a practice area or a managing partner or someone that's leading growth, if they know those parameters and they've set goal and there's agreement to those goals, it's almost liberating, don't you think, in some ways?
It depends on how a person is wired in terms of what their expectation is of themselves and of where they're going career-wise. In the corporate world, you have choices to make as to whether you're going to get on the leader path and become a leader or stay as an individual contributor and being the best you can be as an individual contributor. We don't have the clarification level that we had in corporate America in our firms. You go ahead and then you become a partner someday, and it's like, wait a minute, but I like being an individual contributor, just doing my thing with my book of business. I don't want to be a leader in this firm.
Yeah.
So we have what I'll call a lot of reluctant leaders who, they've been tapped, and, to take it up a next level, you have continuous improvement, not only in the technical realm that they live in, but in the contribution to the firm in terms of its sustainability for the future. And that's where I find a lot of challenges among my firms, but yet some real interesting surprises, pleasant surprises, not only on my part, but the part of the person themselves who didn't know that they were made of this stuff and can really do it.
Gale, this is a long time ago, but I remember sitting down with you probably a year, 18 months into our work with you. And I asked a question as to kind of who you viewed as being a success in our firm. And I won't name any names, but the person you named at the time somewhat caught me by surprise, because it wasn't the glad hand or the person that was always out selling a lot of work. It was actually a person who was very disciplined around how to get into a client, and once in the client, expand the suite of services. And in fact, that person's practice area was built on getting in the door, whether he got in the door or someone introduced him in the door, and expanding him. And so I think going back to the effectiveness of discipline and how it takes someone like that, who otherwise may have just been spinning around and saying, I can grow, but I can grow differently. So growth takes many forms and fashions. You just have to have the discipline to execute the form or fashion that's best for you in the firm.
It's so interesting, Gary. You're right on. I had Accounting Today interview me many years ago and say, can you predict who is going to be successful with a growth program or not? And I said, I wish I could, but I'm always caught wrong. For example, the best rainmaker isn't necessarily the one who can lead and drive growth. And so as a result, I've learned not to predict. And the interesting thing about it is that I finally figured it out, that it's about, you can be the best golfer on the golf course, right? But we're not making people better golfers. We're transferring them to the game of football. And in football, it's not like golf where you're either a good golfer or you're not. You're either a good rainmaker or you're not. It's very binary. When you get over into leader-driven, team-based growth, there are all kinds of positions. There are 11 positions on the field. There are positions in the stands. The fans in the stands play a very important part in a football game. And therefore, you have all kinds of different roles that can be played to contribute to the game and get the team to the Super Bowl. And when we do this transformation, they are leading growth. They're not just doing it. And it's more about being the president of a business unit than an on-the-ground rainmaker. And therefore, the skill set is different. And sometimes the best rainmakers have a really hard time with this because they're individual contributors at a very high level, but can they transform and be the president of the real estate division?
Yeah, those
of the audit division.
Yeah, intuitive skills sometimes don't make their way over to what leadership needs. When you think of golf, since I'm a golfer, as you know, as you are as well.
Yeah,
I can have the best swing on a windless day, where the conditions are beautiful, and I may have just this picture perfect swing. But what happens? We get out on the golf course, and it may have rained. It might have 30-mile-an-hour winds. It may be tight fairways, and I'm not a great driver. And so in that context, when you think about discipline, why is discipline important? Because if you're leading growth and external forces come into play, COVID, new regulations, whatever it may be, discipline does what? It brings you back to the fundamentals.
The fundamentals.
Yeah. Yep. And so, when I'm on a
Mm-hmm.
golf course and it's a windy day, I can begin thinking about fundamentals, but I haven't really thought about that analogy, Gale, until you brought it up. But sometimes we just can't control all the elements, but discipline allows us to rethink it pretty quickly.
It's true, Gary, and you'll look at somebody and they'll be wildly successful with their business unit, and then but then the next, I'll go to the next town and they're not wildly successful. And I know why. They have not taken into account the fundamental. One of the fundamentals, for example, is how big is the market? How many fish are in the pond that actually can be caught? Somebody's in some, way up here part of the pond, and there's a lot of fish there. But, there may not be a lot of fish in another place of the pond or in a different pond. And it's like, that's a fundamental. You've got to look at how many fish are in the pond. You may be thinking, wow, this is great fishing, but you're going to fish it out. Well, if you had thought about that in the first place and looked at the market size, you would have never been in that pond in the first place because you would have known it was limited.
That's true. I'm sure much more than me, but as I work with clients and as I speak and go through the industry, everyone wants to be an advisory right now. Like everyone wants to be an advisory. And to your point, you better understand which fish are out there in the advisory pond, where you need to play, where you need to fish, and be really confident and disciplined about what that is.
Well, and if they want corn and red wigglers and you show up with a live cricket, you're not going to catch any fish. So you better have the right service for the right kind of fish, right?
There you go.
For crappie, and all they have is bass, and they don't like what you have to eat. So
I'm a surf fisherman. So I was just at a beach place weekend before Memorial Day, and I'm out fishing and I'm catching fish. And this guy next to me who's set up with all this professional stuff, he just said, "What are you fishing with?" And I said, "Bloodworms and squid." Very, very simple stuff. Well, he had all the complicated stuff for whatever reason. They weren't biting and mine were. So sometimes you got to know. Oh, by the way, I'm impressed with the fishing lures and all the stuff there. That's good, Gale. I remember that one. Well, look, I want to be respectful of your valuable time as we begin to close our time together, which has been fun. I could go on for hours with you, Gale. And you think about discipline around growth. Any parting thoughts that would be helpful to those that are listening to this in terms of, again, stressing why that word is such an important element?
Yeah, I think my parting comment here, Gary, is, you can go out and you could theoretically become an auditor with no audit training. Would you want to? I don't think so. The trial and error, approach isn't the best. But having the training and then realizing that in audit, the discipline of audit is you can't show up and say, well, I really don't want to audit inventory. I just want to do cash and fixed assets. Well, it's like, well, you could go to jail for that, right? But when it comes to growth, it's really important to understand that you don't have to go through the school of hard knocks and on-the-job training. If you know these principles and somebody has shown you what those principles are, then you can follow them. And then you can use the discipline to say, okay, I'm not going to go over here just because everybody else is doing craft breweries doesn't mean that if you're in Amarillo, Texas, you ought to be doing craft breweries.
Right,
Not
right.
enough in Amarillo.
Right, right.
You'll use that discipline then because you know that the discipline is going to be required and the knowledge is there to execute the discipline to really get great results.
That's a great way to end it, Gail. As I work with leaders more in the practice management area of things, I tell people discipline and accountability sometimes is internal, sometimes it's external. So I know that you and I, have this opportunity to work with practitioners who've been at it for a while and have tried with a great deal of sincerity and effort, but maybe it just takes a little bit of different thinking. And so I appreciate your thoughts on this, Gail. I know that your experiences and my experience in working with you indicates there's a lot of things for us to learn from that. So, Gale, thanks for your time, and thanks for everyone for listening to us today. And we all both look forward to connecting in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks, audience. Enjoy.